All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into a story that's, well, it's messy. We're talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., journalist Olivia Nuzzi, and some allegations about their relationship that have, well, definitely raised some eyebrows.
It's definitely got that truth is stranger than fiction vibe, doesn't it?
It does, and we've got three different articles here, each giving us a different angle on this whole thing. We've got the Daily Beast, New York Post, and Page Six, and honestly, each one makes this whole thing even juicier. But beyond just the headlines and gossip, I think this situation really makes us think about the worlds of politics and media, how they collide, and maybe even about how these forces play out in our own lives.
Definitely, there's some interesting parallels we can unpack there.
So let's jump right in, shall we? The Daily Beast really goes for the jugular right away, focusing on a potential legal battle brewing. It seems RFK Jr. is considering suing Nuzzi, claiming she essentially bombarded him with, and I'm quoting here, increasingly pornographic photos and videos.
Wow.
Right? And it gets even wilder. His security expert, this guy Gavin DeBecker, is quoted as saying, get this, he was being chased by porn.
Chased by porn? I mean, come on.
That's, well, that's some choice of words, isn't it? I mean, it's really interesting how Kennedy, through DeBecker, is so clearly positioning himself as the victim here.
Right.
Using a word like chased, it suggests he was helpless to stop it, right? Like he wasn't, an active participant in whatever their communication was.
Yeah.
It's a very calculated way to try and control how people view this whole situation, don't you think? Absolutely. It really makes you wonder, are these legal threats actually about seeking justice? Or is this just classic powerful person maneuvering to shut down the story before it gets even bigger?
Well, we have to acknowledge this kind of legal tactic is, sadly, nothing new. Powerful figures have used lawsuits, or even just the threat of them, to silence critics for, well, forever, really. It's a way to intimidate, to drain resources, and let's be honest, it often works, unfortunately.
Exactly. So instead of an open conversation, it becomes this scary legal battle that no one really wants to touch. And that can be incredibly expensive and scary, even if you've done absolutely nothing wrong. Okay, so we've heard from the Daily Beast. Let's see what the New York Post has to say. They give us a little more background, mentioning that this alleged relationship supposedly started after Nuzzi interviewed Kennedy for New York Magazine. But, and of course there's a but, we get conflicting stories about who was actually pursuing who romantically.
Classic.
Right. Kennedy's side is saying Nuzzi was obsessed, but then a source close to Nuzzi is claiming both parties were aware of how high pressure and high risk the circumstances were. So it's a classic case of he said, she said. Yeah, what do you make of this? How reliable even are these anonymous sources, especially in a story like this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question with anonymous sources, right? They can be invaluable for journalists trying to get the inside scoop, but you always have to consider the motivations behind them.
It's not always as simple as it seems.
Exactly. Are they trying to protect someone, smear someone else, push a certain agenda? We have to remember every source has a perspective, even if we don't know exactly who they are.
That's a really important point.
And here, both sides are very clearly using those anonymous sources to try and paint a picture that makes them look better, right? Kennedy's team wants us to see him as the target of some unwanted attention, while Nuzzi's side is implying that it was a more, shall we say, complex situation.
And that nuance is really important, especially given the potential power dynamics between a seasoned politician like Kennedy and a, comparatively less powerful journalist.
You said it. That potential imbalance of power is a huge factor in how we interpret these conflicting accounts. We can't just ignore that power differential.
It's like this strategic game they're playing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a game of chess, and every move has a consequence.
And we're trying to figure out everyone's next move.
Yeah, and we, the viewers, are stuck trying to figure out if we're pawns or players in this whole thing.
But it's important what you said. We're not just, like, gossiping here. These are real people, and this situation has real stakes for everyone involved.
Speaking of different players, our third source, Page Six, takes a slightly different approach, shining the spotlight on RFK Jr.'s wife, Cheryl Hines. And of course, they focus on the recent events. Hines was seen publicly without her wedding ring, and naturally, everyone's freaking out. But then, get this, the very next day, she posts photos with Kennedy's daughter at a birthday party. Like nothing happened.
Right.
It's giving very much carefully curated public image amidst a very public family drama.
Oh, for sure.
What do you think? Are we reading too much into this? Or is Hines trying to send a very calculated message here?
I mean, it's impossible to know what's actually going on in her head, but it definitely highlights just how much scrutiny spouses in these situations face, and particularly wives, right?
Yeah. It feels like every public appearance, every little thing they post on social media, it's all analyzed for clues about their relationship. I can't even imagine that kind of pressure, especially while you're dealing with what's probably a very private, very painful personal crisis.
It's a good reminder that behind all the headlines and hot takes, there are real people with real emotions and real lives that are being impacted. And speaking of impact, we have to circle back to something the New York Post mentioned. Well, let's just say it's pretty interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So apparently, back in 2001, RFK Jr. kept these diaries,
Yeah.
right? And in these diaries, he details having affairs while he was married to Mary Richardson Kennedy.
Oh, wow.
And it gets even more interesting because, get this, he uses the word mugged to describe these extramarital affairs. Mugged,
Yeah.
as if he was the victim.
Wow. That's certainly an interesting choice of words. And it's hard to ignore the, shall we say, parallels between how he's describing those past situations and how he's positioning himself now, right? Like it's the same playbook.
Right, makes you wonder.
Now, obviously, we have to be careful about drawing a direct line between events that happen decades apart. People change, situations are never identical, all that. But it does make you think about patterns of behavior and how much weight we should really give to past actions when we're evaluating someone in the present.
So are we saying this is a case of history repeating itself? Or are we projecting a narrative onto RFK Jr. based on choices he made a long time ago?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something we probably should be asking ourselves in all sorts of situations, not just celebrity scandals. How much do those past actions color how we see someone? When does past behavior become relevant to understanding someone's present actions?
It's such a tricky balance. Because on the one hand, people can change, right? We want to believe in growth and all that. But on the other hand, yeah, past behavior can definitely be an indicator of patterns, and those patterns can be revealing. But, even with all of these crazy details and conflicting accounts and who knows what else is going to come out, we have to remember this story is about so much more than just he said, she said, right?
100%.
This is about power and privilege and how those things play out in the real world. It makes you think about the responsibilities journalists have, the way our personal and professional lives intersect and sometimes get messy, and those often unspoken power dynamics that are always at play. What are your thoughts on this? How does this whole saga, with all its twists and turns, connect to the bigger picture for you?
Well, you said it perfectly. This isn't just about RFK Jr. and Olivia Nuzzi as individuals. It's like we're seeing a microcosm of much larger societal issues playing out right in front of us.
I like that. It's like holding up a funhouse mirror to society in a way.
Right. And what's reflected back at us, we're forced to think about those power dynamics that exist in so many areas of life. This story feeds into this ongoing and frankly really important conversation about power dynamics in relationships, especially in fields like media and politics where those dynamics can be so intense. This situation forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about consent, about exploitation, and the potential for abuse of power, even when all parties are adults and supposedly on equal footing, which is often not the case.
And we can't forget about the media's role in all of this, the way they choose to frame the story, the details they decide to emphasize or downplay, the language they use. It all influences how the public perceives these events.
Exactly. Are they just focusing on the alleged relationship itself? Are they digging deeper into the ethical implications? What about the power dynamics we were just talking about and these broader societal issues that this situation brings up?
Because it's easy to get caught up in the gossip. I'm guilty of it too. But we really do have to keep reminding ourselves there's a much bigger, much more complicated picture here. And like you said, this situation, it raises questions about how we, as a society, view power, how we define consent, how we hold people accountable for their actions. And honestly, there are no easy answers to those questions. It's a lot, to be honest. It can feel kind of overwhelming trying to figure out what we're supposed to do with all of this information.
Yeah.
Like, where do we even begin to untangle this whole mess?
Yeah, it's sticky, but for me, it always goes back to awareness, right? Recognizing that these power dynamics, these imbalances, they're not just celebrity gossip. They exist everywhere.
Yeah.
In our workplaces, in our families, in our friend groups even, right?
Oh, totally.
It's about taking a step back and asking ourselves some hard questions about the stories we're consuming, but also, and maybe this is even more important, the stories we're perpetuating, the narratives we buy into without even realizing it.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So as we're trying to navigate all of these allegations and denials, these carefully crafted narratives, what would you say is like the key takeaway, the thing you really hope our listener walks away thinking about today?
I think for me, it comes down to the simple fact, and it is a fact, that everyone has a narrative, right? Everyone has their own story they're telling.
Right.
And a lot of the time, especially when we're talking about powerful people, those narratives are very, very carefully constructed. And they're designed to serve specific interests.
It's about protecting your image.
Exactly.
And that's true for everyone. It's not just these politicians and journalists and high-profile people. We all do it to some degree.
Oh, 100%. We all shape the stories we tell about ourselves, about our experiences, our choices. I think the more interesting question, the thing we really need to be thinking about, is what happens when those narratives inevitably collide?
Right.
Whose story gets told? Whose story gets silenced or ignored? And who ultimately benefits from the way those stories are being told and received?
That's such a good point. It reminds me of that saying, there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth.
Hmm.
And finding that truth, well, it takes work, it takes effort, and sometimes it's just plain messy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, to our listeners, I just want to say thanks for joining us on this very, let's call it a thought-provoking deep dive today.
Yeah.
As you continue to follow this story, and honestly, as you just move through the world, try to remember to look at everything with a critical eye. Question the sources of information, think about people's motivations, and don't be afraid to look beyond the surface. There's always more to the story. Because sometimes, and this is what I really want you to remember, sometimes the most important stories, they're not about the who and the what. They're about the why and the how.
Hmm.
Those are the stories that have the power to really change the way we see things.